A loaded Sig Sauer P226 sat on the white tablecloth right next to the crystal wine glass in a room full of hardened killers. The air had been sucked out of the room. Everyone was waiting for the scream. They were waiting for the trembling hands, the shattered glass, the plea for mercy. But Elara Voss didn't scream. She didn't even blink. She simply reached over the gun, poured the vintage Cabernet without spilling a single drop, and looked the most dangerous man in New York dead in the eye. That was the moment Lorenzo Valtieri realized this wasn't just a waitress, and that was the moment his empire began to crumble. The heavy oak doors of Liel, Manhattan's most exclusive members-only supper club, didn't just keep the noise of the city out, they kept the secrets in. Located in a nondescript brownstone on East 64th Street, just a stone's throw from Central Park, it was the kind of place where politicians shook hands with men who didn't exist on any census. Elara Voss adjusted the collar of her starched white uniform in the staff locker room. She looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror. Tired hazel eyes, hair pulled back into a severe bun that pulled at her scalp, and zero makeup. That was the rule she set for herself. Be invisible. Table 4 is asking for you, Elara. The floor manager, a nervous, sweating man named Gino, hissed as he poked his head in. It's the Valtieri party. They fired Jessica. Elara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. They fired her. They scared her out of the room. She dropped a fork. Just go. And for God's sake, don't look at the scar. Everyone knew the rules of serving the Valtieri family, specifically Lorenzo Valtieri, the capo of the New York underworld. He didn't come to Liel for the risotto. He came to conduct business that the FBI couldn't track. He was 32, lethally handsome in that sharp, predatory way, and possessed a scar that ran through his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a failed assassination attempt in Palermo. Elara nodded, her face a mask of practiced indifference, though her heart was hammering in her chest. I'll handle it. She walked out into the dim amber lighting of the dining room. The air smelled of expensive cigars, cohibas specifically, and aged leather. The restaurant was quiet, the kind of heavy silence where money does the talking. The far end, in the semi-private alcove known as the King's Corner, sat 5 men. They were massive, their suits straining against shoulders built for violence. In the center sat Lorenzo. He wasn't the biggest man at the table, but he took up the most space. He was leaning back, swirling a glass of sparkling water, his dark eyes scanning the room like a security camera. To his right was Salvatore Bianchi, his enforcer, a man whose knuckles were permanently swollen and who was currently cleaning his fingernails with a steak knife. Elara approached the table with the smooth, gliding step she had perfected. She held a silver tray with a fresh bottle of Brunello. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice low and steady, though her heart was hammering in her chest. "Welcome to Liel. My name is Elara, and I'll be taking care of you tonight." Salvatore looked up, sneering. "Where's the blonde? The one who shakes like a leaf?" "She's indisposed," Elara said, placing the fresh glasses down. Clink, clink, clink. The sound was rhythmic, steady. "I'll be taking over for the remainder of the evening." Lorenzo stopped swirling his glass. He turned his head slowly, locking eyes with her. Most women melted or froze under that gaze. It was intense, dissecting. He was looking for fear. It was his currency. "You're new," Lorenzo said. His voice was like gravel wrapped in velvet. "I've been here, Mr. Valtieri," Elara replied, uncorking the wine with a fluid motion. "And I've never seen you. I make it a point not to be seen, sir." "It helps the digestion." A heavy silence fell over the table. Salvatore's mouth dropped open slightly. "You didn't talk back to Lorenzo Valtieri. You didn't make jokes." Lorenzo's eyes narrowed. He leaned forward, the expensive fabric of his Brioni suit rustling. "Is that right? You think you're invisible?" "I'm a waitress, sir," Elara said, pouring the wine. The red liquid spiraled into the glass, stopping exactly at the appropriate line. "My job is to ensure your glass is full and your plate is hot. My identity is irrelevant." Lorenzo watched the wine settle. He watched her hand. It was steady as a surgeon's. What's your name? Elara. Well, Elara, Lorenzo said, picking up his glass but not drinking. Let's see how long you can stay invisible. He flicked his wrist. It happened in a blur. The glass of red wine didn't go to his lips. He threw the contents aggressively across the table, splashing it directly onto Elara's white apron and uniform. The dark red stain bloomed instantly across her chest, looking violently like a gunshot wound. The entire restaurant seemed to freeze. The pianist in the corner stopped playing. The other diners, Wall Street brokers and desperate socialites, averted their eyes, terrified of what was coming next. Elara stood there, the wine dripping from her apron onto her polished black shoes. She didn't gasp. She didn't jump back. She didn't reach for a napkin to frantically dab at herself. She just stood there. Lorenzo smiled, a cold, cruel thing. Oops. Slippery glass. Salvatore snickered. The other men chuckled nervously, waiting for the girl to run away crying like the last one. Elara slowly placed the empty wine bottle on the table. She looked down at the stain, then back up at Lorenzo. Her expression hadn't changed. It was bored. I'll fetch a fresh bottle, Mr. Valtieri, she said, and some sparkling water for the stain on the tablecloth. I'd hate for your cuff to get dirty. Lorenzo watched her go, his smile fading. He looked at Salvatore. She didn't flinch. She's in shock, boss, Salvatore dismissed. She's going to go back to the kitchen and hyperventilate. No, Lorenzo said, his eyes darkening. She saw the throw coming. She braced for it before I even moved. Find out who she is, Salvatore. Tonight. Elara walked into the kitchen, and only then did she let out a breath. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her face remained stone. She grabbed a towel, soaked it in club soda, and dabbed at the wine. Oh my God, Gino whispered, running over. Did he hit you? He threw wine on me, Elara said, her voice detached. I need a fresh apron, and bring me the reserve bottle from the cellar. The reserve? That's expensive. He didn't order that. He will, Elara said. If I bring him the same bottle, he'll break it. He's bored, Gino. He's testing the structural integrity of the staff. Go. Gino ran. Elara turned to the mirror. She repinned her hair. She looked as if the incident had never happened. As she approached the table, the mood had shifted. It was darker. The men weren't eating. They were arguing in hushed, angry Italian. The shipment in Jersey was light, Lorenzo, Salvatore was saying, his face red. Someone is skimming. We'll handle it, Lorenzo snapped. He stopped when he saw Elara. She placed the new bottle on the table. She began to clear the appetizer plates. She reached across Lorenzo to take his plate. As she did, Lorenzo's hand shot out. He grabbed her wrist. His grip was like iron. You cleaned up fast, he said, staring at her pulse point. He was checking her heart rate. Efficient stain remover, she replied, not pulling away. You're not scared. Should I be? Most people are terrified of me, Elara. It's the sensible reaction. Fear makes you clumsy, Elara said. I can't afford to drop these plates. They come out of my paycheck. Lorenzo released her wrist. He reached into his jacket. The movement was slow, deliberate. Every man at the table stiffened. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with static. Lorenzo pulled out a gun. It was a black Sig Sauer P226, heavy, lethal, and very real. He placed it on the table with a loud thud, right next to his fork. The barrel was pointed vaguely in Elara's direction. I don't like the wine, Lorenzo lied. Take it back. This was the test. The true test. He wanted to see if she would break. A waitress sees a gun. She screams. She calls the cops. She faints. Salvatore watched, his hand hovering near his own waistband. Elara looked at the gun. She looked at the safety. It was off. A live round was chambered. She could see the brass glinting. Don't look at the gun. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Look at the man. The gun is just a tool. The man is the threat. Elara didn't step back. She didn't tremble. She simply reached out with her left hand. "Excuse me," she said politely. She picked up the gun. Salvatore half rose from his seat, his eyes bulging. "What the hell?" Elara moved the gun inches to the right, creating space on the tablecloth. Then she placed a fresh napkin down where the gun had been, smoothed it out, and set a bowl of hot truffle soup on top of it. Then she picked the gun up again and set it back down next to the soup, perfectly aligned with the cutlery. "The soup is hot, sir," she said. "Please be careful not to knock the weapon into the broth. Gun oil ruins the flavor of truffles." Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Salvatore looked like he had been slapped. The other bodyguards were staring at her with their mouths slightly agape. No one touched Lorenzo's gun. No one. Lorenzo stared at the gun, then up at her. The predatory look vanished, replaced by genuine shock. "You moved my piece," Lorenzo said softly. "It was in the way of the service, sir," Elara replied. "Is there anything else I can get you? Fresh pepper?" Lorenzo slowly started to laugh. It wasn't a nice laugh, but it was a genuine one. He shook his head, looking at Salvatore. She moved the piece. "Salvatore, did you see that?" "I saw it, boss." Salvatore grunted, eyeing Elara suspiciously. "She's crazy." "No," Lorenzo said, looking back at Elara. His eyes were now gleaming with a dangerous kind of curiosity. "She's not crazy. She's interesting." He picked up the spoon and took a sip of the soup, never breaking eye contact with her. "What's your last name, Elara?" "Voss, sir." "Elara Voss." He tasted the name. "You're done for the night." "Sir? You're done waiting tables. Sit down." "I can't do that, sir. I'm on the clock." "I just bought the restaurant," Lorenzo said calmly. He signaled to the terrified manager, Gino, who was hovering by the entrance. "Gino, put it on my tab. The whole place. Everyone out, except her." Gino nodded frantically and began ushering confused diners out the door. Elara stood her ground. "Mr. Valtieri, I really need to finish my shift. I have rent to pay." Lorenzo leaned back, resting his hand on the gun she had moved. "Sit down, Elara, or I'll start shooting the bottles behind the bar. And that's a lot of broken glass to clean up." Elara hesitated. She looked at the exit, then at Lorenzo. She knew men like him. If she ran, he'd chase. If she stayed, she was playing a game she hadn't prepared for. She pulled out the chair opposite him and sat down. "Excellent," Lorenzo smiled. "Salvatore, leave us." "Boss, you can't be serious." "We don't know who she is," Salvatore protested. "That's exactly why you're leaving," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping an octave. "I want to find out." Salvatore glared at Elara, a silent promise of violence, before signaling the men to leave. They retreated to the bar area, leaving Elara alone in the candlelight with the King of New York. "So," Lorenzo said, leaning in, "who taught you that the safety was off on a P226? Most waitresses wouldn't know the difference between a water pistol and a semi-automatic." Elara folded her hands in her lap. The calm facade was still there, but inside her mind was racing. He had noticed. Of course he had noticed. "I grew up in a bad neighborhood," she lied smoothly. "You learn things." "I grew up in the worst neighborhood," Lorenzo countered. "And I know a lie when I hear one. You handled that gun like it was an extension of your hand. You didn't look at the trigger guard. You kept your finger indexed on the frame. That's muscle memory." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a gold lighter. He flicked it open, the flame dancing between them. "I have a traitor in my organization, Elara. Someone who knows things they shouldn't. Someone trained." He held the flame close to her face, illuminating her hazel eyes. "Are you here to kill me?" he whispered. Elara didn't blink. "If I wanted to kill you, Mr. Valtieri, I wouldn't have moved the gun. I would have used the steak knife while you were looking at your wine." Lorenzo froze. The flame flickered. Then he snapped the lighter shut. Darkness returned to the booth. "You have guts," he said. "I like that. But now I have a problem. I can't let you leave." "Why not?" Because you interest me, Lorenzo said, his voice low and dangerous. And until I figure out exactly what you are, you belong to me. You belong to me. The words hung in the air, heavier than the smoke from the cigar Lorenzo had just lit. It wasn't a pickup line. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a sentence, a verdict. Elara felt a cold trickle of genuine alarm slide down her spine. She had spent years building this life. A boring apartment in Queens, a cat named Oatmeal, a job where she was treated like furniture. She had buried Agent Elara Voss, her real name, her real life, under layers of cheap polyester uniforms and silence. But in minutes, one slip of the hand, one moment of reflexively handling a weapon, had undone it all. I can't belong to you, Elara said, gripping the water bottle. I have a shift tomorrow. Lorenzo poured himself a scotch. He looked tired now. The predator energy had dimmed, replaced by the exhaustion of a man who carried a target on his back 24/7. He loosened his tie, unbuttoning his collar. Relax, Elara. The windows are bulletproof. The walls are reinforced concrete. You're safer here than anywhere else in the world. He walked over to the table and sat down. Where are we going? Elara asked, changing the subject. She couldn't handle the emotional weight of his stare. The Spire, Lorenzo said. My home. It's the only place in this city where I can sleep with both eyes closed. And what happens when we get there? Lorenzo turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto hers. Then, Elara Voss, I'm going to run a background check on you that goes so deep it will tell me what brand of cereal you ate when you were 6. And if your story about the bad cop checks out, I'll give you a job, a real job. And if it doesn't, Elara asked, gripping the water bottle. Lorenzo didn't answer immediately. He looked at Salvatore's thick neck in the front seat, then back at her. Then we'll find out if you bleed as calmly as you pour wine. The Spire was a glass needle piercing the Manhattan skyline. Lorenzo's penthouse occupied the top floors, a fortress in the sky. The elevator ride was silent and agonizingly long. It required a key card, a fingerprint scan, and a retinal scan from Lorenzo just to get the doors to close. Elara noted the make and model of the security panel. Biometric lock, encrypted, likely hardwired to a localized server, unhackable from the outside. When the doors opened, Elara stepped into a cavernous space of glass, steel, and black marble, beautiful, cold, and utterly impersonal. Don't go near the windows, Lorenzo commanded as he stepped out. The glass is bulletproof, but I'd rather not test the sniper rifles the Russians are importing. Elara stood in the center of the room, feeling small. So what now? I'm your prisoner. Lorenzo poured himself a drink. Whiskey. Neat. He downed it in one swallow and poured another. He looked exhausted. The mask of the untouchable dawn was slipping, revealing a man carrying the weight of an empire. You are my guest, Elara. A prisoner doesn't get a choice. You have a choice. He walked over to her, extending the glass. Drink. It helps. She took it, her fingers brushing his. A spark, sharp and electric, jumped between them. Lorenzo pulled his hand back slowly. What choice do I have? She asked, taking a sip. The liquor burned, grounding her. You can help me find the key, Lorenzo said. We go to the bakery. We find what Rosa hid. You give it to me, and in exchange, I give you a new identity, a passport, and enough money to disappear to anywhere in the world. Paris, Tokyo. You choose. And if I don't help you? Lorenzo stepped closer, the heat of his body radiating toward her. Then the Russians find you, and they won't offer you a passport. They will torture you until you break, and then they will kill you to send a message to me. Elara looked into his dark eyes. She saw ruthlessness there. Yes, but she also saw something else. Desperation? No, responsibility. Why is this key so important? She whispered. Is it just money? Lorenzo let out a bitter laugh. Money? I have money, Elara. I have more money than God. The key isn't to a bank vault. It's to a storage unit my father maintained. Inside is a ledger. A ledger? Blackmail? He corrected. Names, dates, payoffs, judges, senators, police captains. The entire infrastructure that allows the families to operate in New York. My father, the old Don, kept the peace because he held the leash on everyone. When he died, the ledger vanished. If the Russians get it, they control the city. They will purge the Italian families. It will be a bloodbath. He looked at her, his expression softening for the first time. I'm not doing this just for power. I'm doing it to stop a war. Elara studied him. He was a criminal, a killer, but in this light, with his tie undone and his guard down, he seemed human. I need to shower, she said softly. I need to wash the hospital off me. Lorenzo nodded. Down the hall, second door on the left. There are clothes in the closet. They belong to my sister. She stays here sometimes. They should fit. As Elara walked away, Lorenzo watched her. He had spent years looking for Rosa and the key. He had expected to find a hardened criminal or a cunning thief. He hadn't expected a waitress with soulful eyes and a spirit that refused to break. He pulled out his phone and dialed Salvatore. Prepare the team, Lorenzo said. We hit the bakery. Lorenzo. It's a risk, Salvatore's voice crackled. The Russians are watching the old woman's properties. I know, Lorenzo said, watching the bathroom door close. But she trusts me, just a little. And right now, that's the only weapon we have. The rain had turned into a deluge. Queens was asleep, but the shadows were awake. Rosa's Pastries sat on a corner lot in Astoria, a small brick building with a faded awning. It had been closed for weeks since Nonna Rosa fell ill. Now it looked like a tomb. Lorenzo parked the black SUV a block away. Stay close to me, he ordered, checking the clip of his gun. If I say run, you run. You don't look back. You don't wait for me, understand? Elara nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was wearing black leggings and a dark sweater she'd found in the penthouse, her hair tied back. She looked less like a waitress and more like an accomplice. They moved through the alleyway. Lorenzo moved with the silent lethality of a panther, checking corners, scanning rooftops. He picked the lock on the back door in seconds. The smell hit Elara the moment they stepped inside. Vanilla, yeast, and dust, the scent of her childhood. Tears pricked her eyes. This was where she had learned to walk, where she had learned to knead dough, where she had learned arboresh while dusting flour off the counter. Where? Lorenzo whispered. The bakery was dark, lit only by the streetlights filtering through the front display window. The main counter, Elara whispered back. She said under the floorboards, but she spent all her time at the kneading station. She walked toward the large wooden table in the center of the kitchen. It was scarred from decades of knives and rolling pins. Elara knelt down. The floorboards here were worn smooth. Here, she pointed to a board that looked slightly looser than the rest. The nail head. It's not flush. Lorenzo knelt beside her. He pulled a knife from his boot and wedged it into the gap. With a groan of protest, the wood pried upward. Beneath was a hollow space, and inside the dark cavity sat a rusted tin box, a box that used to hold saffron. Elara's hands trembled as she lifted it out. This is it. Open it, Lorenzo commanded, his voice tight. She pried the lid off. Inside there was no golden key, no diamond. There was a rosary made of black wooden beads and a stack of index cards. Recipes: cannoli, sfogliatella, tiramisu. It's just recipes, Elara whispered, panic rising. Did she lie? Lorenzo grabbed the box, rifling through the cards. No, Rosa didn't lie. She was smart. He held up a card for almond biscotti. Look at the measurements. 120 grams of sugar, 45 grams of almonds, 2 eggs, 19 minutes bake time. He flipped to the next one. 140 grams flour, 20 grams anise. Their coordinates, Lorenzo realized, his eyes widening. Or a combination. The numbers. They correspond to the bank box. The recipe is the key. Crash. The front window of the bakery shattered inward. A canister rolled across the floor, spewing white smoke. Down. Lorenzo tackled Elara, covering her body with his own just as the room filled with the deafening rat-tat of automatic gunfire. Bullets chewed up the wooden counter above their heads, sending splinters raining down like confetti. "They found us!" Elara screamed, covering her ears. "Stay down!" Lorenzo drew his gun. He rolled out from behind the island, firing 3 controlled shots into the smoke. A grunt of pain echoed from the front of the store. "Back door, go!" Lorenzo grabbed Elara by the waistband of her pants and shoved her toward the exit. They scrambled through the kitchen, slipping on the flour that had spilled from punctured bags. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of cordite. A massive figure loomed in the back doorway, a Russian enforcer. He raised a shotgun. Lorenzo didn't hesitate. He didn't slow down. He fired while running. Bang! Bang! The Russian crumbled. Lorenzo kicked the shotgun away as they burst into the rainy alley. "To the car! Move!" They sprinted down the wet pavement, but the Russians were everywhere. 2 more men emerged from behind a dumpster. Lorenzo shoved Elara behind a stack of crates. He engaged them, trading fire in the narrow alley. It was chaotic, loud, and terrifying. Elara clutched the tin box to her chest. This was the only thing that mattered. "Lorenzo!" She screamed as she saw a 3rd gunman appear on the fire escape above him. Lorenzo looked up, but he was a split second too slow. Bang! The shot hit him. Lorenzo spun around, clutching his left shoulder, stumbling back. "No!" Elara didn't think. She didn't calculate. She grabbed a heavy glass bottle from a crate of recycling beside her and hurled it with all her might at the gunman on the ground who was advancing on the fallen dawn. It didn't knock him out, but it distracted him. He flinched. That second was all Lorenzo needed. Even wounded, he was deadly. He raised his gun and fired a single shot. The man dropped. Lorenzo groaned, his face pale. Blood was already soaking through his white shirt. He looked at Elara, his eyes hazy with pain but burning with intensity. You threw a bottle," he wheezed, a ghost of a grin appearing. "Get up." Elara ran to him, grabbing his good arm. "We have to go." She hauled him up. He was heavy, dead weight, but adrenaline gave her strength she didn't know she had. They stumbled toward the car. Lorenzo fumbled for the keys, dropping them. Elara snatched them from the puddle. "I'm driving," she yelled. "You don't know how to drive a Maybach," he gritted out, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "It has a steering wheel and a pedal, doesn't it? Get in." She shoved the most feared Mafia boss in New York into the passenger seat, jumped behind the wheel, and slammed the car into gear. Tires screeched. The engine roared. Elara floored it, clipping the side of a dumpster as she tore out of the alley, leaving the chaos of the bakery behind them. As they sped onto the highway, putting distance between them and the death squad, Elara glanced over. Lorenzo was slumped against the window, his breathing shallow, the blood spreading fast. Weakly, he looked at the woman driving his car. She was crying. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry." He reached for the door handle. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'm sorry." He reached for the door handle. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'm sorry." He reached for the door handle. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'm sorry." He reached for the door handle. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'm sorry." He reached for the door handle. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'm sorry." He reached for the door handle. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'm sorry." He reached for the door handle. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'm sorry." He reached for the door handle. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'm sorry." He reached for the door handle. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'm sorry." He reached for the door handle. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'm sorry." He reached for the door handle. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'm sorry." He reached for the door handle. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'm sorry." He reached for the door handle. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'm sorry." He reached for the door handle. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'm sorry." He reached for the door handle. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'm sorry." He reached for the door handle. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'm sorry." He reached for the door handle. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'm sorry." He reached for the door handle. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'm sorry." He reached for the door handle. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'm sorry." He reached for the door handle. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'm sorry." He reached for the door handle. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'm sorry." He reached for the door handle. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'm sorry." He reached for the door handle. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'm sorry." He reached for the door handle. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'm sorry." He reached for the door handle. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'm sorry." He looked at the woman driving his car like a getaway driver, her hair wild, her face smudged with flour and gunpowder. "Elara," he whispered. "What? What is it?" "The recipe," he murmured, his eyes fluttering shut. "Don't lose the recipe." "I have it," she sobbed. "I have the box. Just stay awake." But Lorenzo Valtieri, the king of the city, didn't answer. His head lolled forward. Elara gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She wasn't driving to the safe house. She knew he would bleed out before they got there. She was driving to the only place she knew she could hide, an old veterinary clinic in the Bronx run by her cousin. "Hold on, Lorenzo," she whispered, realizing with a jolt of horror that she wasn't just saving him for the money anymore. She was saving him because, in the middle of the gunfire, he had used his body as a shield for hers. And no one had ever done that for Elara Voss. The neon sign of Benny's animal clinic buzzed erratically in the Bronx rain. Elara pounded on the metal shutters, her hands slick with Lorenzo's blood. "Benny, open up! It's Elara!" she screamed, looking over her shoulder at the empty street. Every pair of headlights felt like a Russian hit squad. The shutter rattled up a few feet. A scruffy man in boxer shorts and a tank top peered out, holding a baseball bat. "Elara, it's late." "What the hell?" "Help me," she begged, tears streaking the grime on her face. "Please, Benny. No questions. Just help." Benny looked at her, then passed her to the battered Maybach idling at the curb. He saw the dark shape slumped in the passenger seat. He didn't ask. He just threw the shutter up. "Bring him in the back room, now." Dragging Lorenzo Valtieri, 190 pounds of dead weight, was the hardest thing Elara had ever done. With Benny's help, they hoisted him onto a stainless steel operating table usually reserved for Great Danes. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, Lorenzo looked like a fallen angel. His skin was gray, his breathing wet and ragged. The bullet had torn through his left shoulder, dangerously close to the artery. "Jesus, Elara," Benny hissed, cutting open Lorenzo's shirt with trauma shears. "This guy is wearing an expensive suit and carrying a piece. Who is he?" "No, don't tell me. I don't want to know." "Just save him," Elara pleaded, gripping Lorenzo's cold hand. "I'm a vet, Elara. I fix cats. Humans are different. A bullet is a bullet, Benny." "Get it out." Benny cursed, grabbing a bottle of rubbing alcohol and a scalpel. "Hold him down. If he wakes up, he's going to thrash." Elara leaned over Lorenzo, brushing the damp hair from his forehead. "Lorenzo," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Lorenzo, you have to stay still. We're going to fix you." Benny poured the alcohol directly into the wound. Lorenzo's eyes flew open. He didn't scream. He let out a guttural roar, his back arching off the table. His hand shot out, gripping Elara's wrist with bruising force. "Look at me," Elara commanded, staring into his dilated, pain-filled eyes. "Look at me, Lorenzo. You're safe. I'm here. I'm right here." The recognition slowly flooded back into his gaze. The feral panic receded, replaced by an agony-laced focus. He squeezed her wrist, anchoring himself to her. "Do it!" Lorenzo gritted out through clenched teeth. Benny went to work. The sound of metal probing flesh was sickening. Elara didn't look away. She kept her eyes locked on Lorenzo's, whispering soft reassurances in Italian, the same way she used to comfort her grandmother. "Resist. Sei forte. Passerà. Hold on. You're strong. It will pass." When the bullet clanged into the metal tray, Lorenzo slumped back, exhaling a shuddering breath. Benny quickly stitched the wound, his hands shaking but efficient. "He's lucky." Benny wiped his brow. It missed the subclavian artery by an inch. "He's lost a lot of blood, but he'll live." Benny bandaged the shoulder and stepped back. "I'm going to clean up out front. Lock the door. If anyone comes, we were never here." The room fell silent save for the hum of the refrigerator. Elara grabbed a wet cloth and began to gently wipe the blood and sweat from Lorenzo's face. He watched her, his eyes half-lidded but lucid. "You didn't run," he murmured, his voice rough like gravel. "I was driving," she said, wringing out the cloth. "Kind of hard to run while driving." "You know what I mean," Lorenzo said. He tried to sit up, wincing. Elara put a hand on his chest to stop him. "Stay down. You almost died." "Why, Elara?" He captured her hand, pressing it against his chest, right over his beating heart. "You could have left me in that alley. You could have taken the car and the money and disappeared. Why bring me here?" Elara looked at their joined hands. The contrast, her waitress hand, rough from work, against his manicured, powerful hand, was stark. "Because you didn't leave me," she said softly. "At the hospital, in the bakery, you shielded me. No one has ever done that for me." Lorenzo looked at her with a raw intensity that made her knees weak. "I promised I wouldn't let you leave," he whispered. "I intend to keep that promise." He pulled her down. He kissed her back with a hunger that had. He kissed her back with a hunger that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with survival. It was a seal, a pact forged in the fire of the night. When she pulled away, breathless, Lorenzo's eyes were dark. "The box," he said. "Show me the recipes." Dawn was breaking over the Bronx, painting the sky in bruised purples and grays. Lorenzo was sitting up on the edge of the cot in the back room, his arm in a sling made from a bandage. Despite the blood loss, his mind was sharp again. The predator was back. On the small metal desk, the index cards were spread out. Cannoli, tiramisu, biscotti, marinara sauce. "It's a substitution cipher," Lorenzo muttered, moving the cards around with his good hand. Rosa was old school. She wouldn't use digital encryption. She used memory. Elara stood beside him, sipping a mug of terrible instant coffee Benny had made. "You said the ingredients were numbers." "Yes. Look." Lorenzo pointed to the marinara card. 3 pounds of tomatoes, 1 cup of basil, 4 cloves of garlic, 314 pie, Elara guessed. "No, an area code. 314 is St. Louis. My father had no business in St. Louis. It's a distraction." He swept that card aside. He picked up the cannoli recipe. "This one is different. Look at the handwriting." Elara squinted. "It's shakier, older." "No." Lorenzo pointed to the bottom corner. "It's stamped Cosa Nostra Press. This isn't a family recipe. It's a key." He read the ingredients aloud. 2 cups flour, 5 teaspoons sugar, 7 drops of vanilla, 0 nuts. 2,570? Elara repeated. "Does that mean anything to you?" Lorenzo went still. The color drained from his face, leaving him paler than he had been during the surgery. 2,570, he whispered. "That's not a bank account. That's a date." "July 25th is the day my father was murdered," Lorenzo said, his voice hollow. "I found him." He flipped the card over. On the back, in faint pencil, was a single word written in Arberish. Verita. "The truth," Elara translated instantly. The ledger isn't just about money, Lorenzo realized, standing up, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. My father didn't hide the money to keep it from the Russians. He hid it to keep it from us. What do you mean? The night he died, the security system was disabled. Only family could do that. I always thought it was a glitch. But if Rosa hid this, he looked at Elara, his eyes burning with a terrible realization. She knew who killed him. It wasn't an enemy. It was someone inside. Elara felt a chill run down her spine. Who? Lorenzo picked up his phone. It had been destroyed in the firefight. The screen shattered. He threw it in the trash. Benny? Lorenzo called out. The vet poked his head in. Yeah? I need a burner phone and a car that isn't a bullet-riddled Maybach. I got an old Ford truck out back and a prepaid Nokia. Good. Lorenzo turned to Elara. 2570 is the code to the private vault at Grand Central Terminal. The old lockers, they don't exist officially anymore, but the family kept one. We're going there. I'm going there, Lorenzo corrected. You are staying here. No, Elara said firmly, crossing her arms. The Russians know my face, Lorenzo. They know your brother's face. They don't know me as anything other than the waitress. And if you walk into Grand Central bleeding through your shirt, you'll be arrested in seconds. You need me. Lorenzo glared at her. He wanted to protect her. He wanted to lock her in this room where she was safe. But he looked at her chin held high and the fire in her eyes. She wasn't the scared girl from the club anymore. She was a partner. Fine, he conceded. But if I say run, I know, I run. An hour later, they were in Manhattan. The city was waking up, the streets filled with commuters. Elara drove the rusted Ford truck, blending into the traffic. Lorenzo sat low in the seat, wearing a borrowed oversized hoodie of Benny's that covered his sling. They parked blocks away. The walk to Grand Central was tense. Every siren made them flinch. They reached the terminal. The vaulted ceiling painted with constellations looked down on them indifferently. They moved to the lower levels, past the food court, down a corridor that was under construction. Lorenzo moved a heavy plywood barrier aside. Behind it was a dusty wall of old metal lockers, remnants of a bygone era. Locker 2570. Lorenzo counted down the rows. He found it. It was rusted shut. He didn't use a key. He used a crowbar he'd taken from the truck. With a groan of metal, the door popped open. Inside was a single leather-bound book. The ledger? Lorenzo grabbed it. He opened the first page. His breath hitched. What is it? Elara asked, looking over his shoulder. Lorenzo didn't speak. He just pointed to the entry dated July 25th. Payment, $500,000. Recipient, Volkov Bratva. Authorized by M. Valtieri. Elara gasped. M. Valtieri. Marco. My brother, Lorenzo whispered, the betrayal cutting deeper than the bullet. My own brother paid the Russians to kill our father so he could take the throne. But it failed. The family chose me instead. That's why he's working with them now. He's been trying to finish the job. Oh my God. Lorenzo. Elara reached for his arm. Suddenly, a slow clap echoed through the empty corridor. Bravo, little brother, you finally figured it out. Lorenzo and Elara spun around. Standing at the end of the hallway was Marco Valtieri. He was flanked by 4 Russian soldiers, and he was holding a gun pointed directly at Elara's head. I have to admit, Marco smiled, a cold, shark-like grin. I thought you'd bleed out in the Bronx. You're harder to kill than the old man. Let her go, Marco, Lorenzo said, his voice deadly calm, though his hand drifted toward the gun tucked in his waistband. This is between us. It was, Marco shrugged, until she answered that call. Now she's just loose baggage. He cocked the hammer. Give me the book, Lorenzo, or the girl dies first. Lorenzo looked at the book, the proof that could destroy his brother and save the city. Then he looked at Elara. He slowly held the book out. Take it, Lorenzo said. Marco laughed. I knew you were weak. You always let your heart get in the way of business. Marco signaled one of the Russians to move forward to take the book. Elara, Lorenzo said quietly, not moving his lips. Yes. She barely breathed. Duck. Duck. The word was barely a vibration in the air. Elara didn't hesitate. She didn't question. She dropped to the dirty concrete floor of the tunnel just as Lorenzo's arm snapped upward. He didn't hand the book to the Russian. He hurled the heavy leather-bound ledger straight up, smashing it into the hanging industrial light fixture above them. Crash! The bulb exploded. Sparks showered down like fireworks, and for a split second the corridor was plunged into disorientation. The Russian guard looked up instinctively. That was his last mistake. Lorenzo moved with terrifying speed. He drew the gun from his waistband, a smooth, practiced motion despite his injured shoulder, and fired twice. The two Russians closest to him dropped before the leather book even hit the ground. "Kill him!" Marco screamed, scrambling back behind a concrete pillar. The remaining two mercenaries opened fire. The hallway erupted in a cacophony of deafening noise and muzzle flashes. Elara crawled on her hands and knees, the concrete biting into her skin. Bullets chipped away at the wall, inches above her head, sending dust into her eyes. She saw the crowbar Lorenzo had dropped near the lockers. She grabbed it. It was heavy, cold, and rusted. Lorenzo had rolled behind a stack of construction pallets. He was pinned down. He had the angle on one Russian, but Marco had the angle on him. "It's over, Lorenzo," Marco shouted over the gunfire. "You're bleeding out. Just die already." Lorenzo peered around the edge, firing a suppression shot. He was pale, sweat beading on his forehead. The wound in his shoulder had reopened. A fresh crimson stain was spreading across the gray hoodie. Elara saw Marco moving. He was flanking Lorenzo, moving through the shadows of the construction zone, his gun raised, a cruel smile on his face. He was going to execute his brother from behind. Lorenzo didn't see him. He was focused on the Russians. Elara's fear vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp rage. This man had killed her grandmother's employer. He had destroyed her life, and now he was going to kill the man she loved. She didn't scream. She didn't warn Lorenzo. She moved. Gripping the crowbar with both hands, Elara surged forward from the darkness. As Marco stepped out to take the kill shot, Elara swung the iron bar with every ounce of strength she possessed. Crack! The iron connected with Marco's forearm. The bone snapped audibly. Marco howled in shock and pain, his gun clattering to the floor. He spun around, eyes wide with disbelief. "You little—" He reached for her with his good hand, his gun raised. Bang! Marco stiffened. His grip on Elara's throat loosened instantly. He looked down. A small red flower was blooming in the center of his chest. He looked past Elara. Lorenzo stood feet away. He had stepped out from cover, ignoring the Russian who was still firing wildly. He stood tall, his gun steady, smoke curling from the barrel. His eyes were void of brotherly love. They held only the icy judgment of a dawn. "You let her go," Lorenzo said, his voice quiet enough to cut through the ringing in their ears. Marco slumped, sliding down the wall. He fell to his knees, gasping. "Lorenzo, I did it for the family." "You did it for yourself," Lorenzo replied. He walked over, kicking Marco's backup weapon away. The last Russian mercenary, seeing his paymaster dying and the legendary Lorenzo Valtieri standing over him, made a business decision. He dropped his rifle and ran back toward the tunnel entrance, his footsteps fading into the distance. Silence returned to the corridor, broken only by Marco's ragged breathing. Lorenzo looked down at his brother. There was no triumph in his face, only a deep, weary sadness. "The ledger," Marco wheezed, blood bubbling on his lips. "The Russians will burn the city if they don't get it." Lorenzo reached down and picked up the book from the floor. He dusted off the cover. "The Russians aren't getting anything, and neither are you." Marco's eyes glazed over. "Don't let her leave." He muttered, repeating the phrase that had started it all, though his meaning was lost to death. Marco Valtieri slumped forward. Gone. Lorenzo stood there for a long moment. Then his legs gave out. Lorenzo! Elara rushed to him, catching him before he hit the ground. She lowered him gently, pressing her hands against his shoulder. Lorenzo, stay with me. It's over. We won. Lorenzo looked up at her. His vision was blurring, the adrenaline crash hitting him like a freight train. He reached up, his bloody hand cupping her cheek. You, he whispered, a weak smile forming. You hit a capo with a crowbar. Elara laughed through her tears, a choked, sobbing sound. I told you I'm not just a waitress. Sirens began to wail in the distance. The gunfight had been heard. The NYPD was coming. We have to go, Elara said, trying to pull him up. Leave me, Lorenzo said, pushing her gently. Take the book. Go to the FBI. I'll take the blame for Marco. I'll buy you time. Elara stared at him. You really think I'm going to leave you now? After all this? She kissed him hard, tasting the metallic tang of blood and the salt of tears. If we go to prison, we go together. If we run together. But I am never leaving. Lorenzo looked at her, and for the first time in his life, he didn't see a liability. He saw his equal. He nodded. Then we run. With Elara supporting his weight, they limped toward the service exit, disappearing into the shadows of the underground just as the tactical lights of the SWAT team swept across the body of the traitor. Months later, the sun over the Amalfi Coast was different than the sun in New York. It was warmer, heavier, smelling of lemons and sea salt. Elara wiped her hands on her apron and placed the tray of fresh sfogliatelle in the display window. The sign above the door read, La Dolce Vita, the sweet life. It was a small bakery in a quiet village perched on the cliffs. It was perfect. The bell above the door chimed. Elara turned, a smile already forming on her lips. We're closed for siesta, signor. For everyone? A deep, familiar voice asked. Or just for the tourists? Lorenzo stepped inside. He looked different. The dark circles under his eyes were gone. The bullet wound in his shoulder had healed into a jagged scar, but his movement was fluid again. He wore a simple linen shirt and trousers. No suit, no tie, but he still commanded the room. He walked behind the counter, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He kissed the sensitive spot behind her ear. How is business? He asked. Quiet, Elara said, leaning into him. Just how we like it. Good. Lorenzo reached into his pocket and pulled out a letter. He placed it on the counter next to the flower. News from New York. Elara looked at it. It was a newspaper clipping. Mass arrests and corruption scandal. Anonymous tip leads to cleanup of city officials. You sent the ledger, she said. We sent the ledger, Lorenzo corrected. It was the right thing to do. The Volkovs are in retreat. The families are scrambling. The city is healing. And us? Elara turned in his arms, looking up at him. Are we healing? Lorenzo looked at her. He thought about the night in the club, the fear in her eyes when she answered that phone. He thought about the hospital, the bakery, the tunnel. He thought about how close he had come to losing everything. He took her hand, the hand that had kneaded dough, thrown bottles, and wielded a crowbar, and kissed her palm. I spent my whole life thinking power was silence, Lorenzo said softly, thinking that if I controlled everything, I was safe. But I was just lonely. He brushed a stray curl from her forehead. You saved me, Elara. Not just from the bullet. You saved me from the silence. Elara smiled, her eyes shining. Well, Nonna always said the secret ingredient is love, or maybe it was gunpowder. I can't remember. Lorenzo laughed, a rich, genuine sound that filled the small bakery. I have a question, he said, his expression turning serious again. Yes. That night in the club, Lorenzo whispered, leaning close, his lips brushing hers. When I said don't let her leave, did you hate me? Elara thought about it. I was terrified of you. And now? Elara grabbed him by the shirt collar and pulled him down for a kiss that tasted of sugar and promise. Now, she whispered against his lips. Now you couldn't make me leave if you tried. Lorenzo smiled, closing his eyes as he held her tight. Good, the former Don whispered, because I'm never letting you go. Wow. From a waitress terrified to speak to the woman who took down a Mafia empire with a crowbar. Elara and Lorenzo's story proves that sometimes the wrong number is actually the right call. I want to know what you guys think. Was Lorenzo right to give up the ledger and his power for a quiet life in Italy? Or should he have stayed and ruled New York? And be honest, would you have forgiven Marco, or did he get exactly what he deserved? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And if you want more Mafia romances, twists, and dramatic stories, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a video. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next.